thank you all for coming on this freezing cold morning, the second last week of term. We're very privileged today to have Paula Meehan here, firstly to read some of her poems, and then we'll have a conversation together about her work, Painting Rain. Those of you who've already read Paula's work will know what a unique voice you've encountered. Certainly I remember myself emerging from school where I'd read the great poets that seemed very remote from me, and it was really an extraordinary experience as a young woman to encounter Paula's work and to feel that intensity of engagement with a life that I could understand, with a life that was going on around us, especially those of us perhaps from Dublin would feel that especially strongly. So I'm really delighted to get the opportunity to chat with Paula about her work, and perhaps more importantly to hear her read for us first. Thanks very much, Paula.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much, Lucy. Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure how the sound system works, so I think up the back, if you can't hear me, will you let me know, send a signal that you can't hear me, and I'll try and project more. So it's great to be here and to bring the poems here to you this morning. I thought I'd start with a poem that really remembers my grandmother, to honour the ancestors first, Hannah Rafe. And I came across her as a 6-year-old child in the census, the online census, the 1901 and the 1911 census. And any of you who have ancestors in Ireland in those years, probably in your case great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, can go online and see the census return they made. And so I found my grandmother as a 6-year-old girl in Lower Tyrone Street, down off Amiens Street, in the heart of Monto, the red light district there, which was, when she was a child, the biggest red light district in Europe. The pull-out of the, no pun intended, the pull-out of the garrison, the soldiers, after the revolution. So Hannah was a child there, and she was a fantastic presence in my life. She was one of those great inner city women. Very, very pious, great devotion to Our Lady. I spent a lot of my childhood on my knees around the city churches, lighting candles before the shrines. And at the same time, she was completely anti-clerical. I mean, she had absolutely no tolerance for the church, for the formal, the priestly caste, so to speak. So this is Hannah, grandmother. Coldest day yet of November, her voice close in my ear. Tell them priests nothing. Was I 12, 13? Filthy minded. Keep your sins to yourself. Don't be giving them a thrill, dirty old feckers. As close as she came to the birds and the bees, on her knees in front of the Madonna, Our Lady of the Facts of Life, beside the confessional, oak door closing like a coffin lid, neatly carpentered, waxed and buffed. In the well-made box of this poem, her voice dies. She closes her eyes and lowers her brow to her joined hands, prays hard, woman to woman. My grandfather, Watty, taught me to read and write before I went to school, which was a huge gift, a great gift. It meant that when I went into the school system, I had some way of decoding what was going on, the mysteries of those years in the classroom in the Central Model Girls' School in Gardner Street. So this is a poem called A Remembrance of My Grandfather Watty, who taught me to read and write. And he hardly appears in it, really. It's dedicated to Seamus Heaney, and I wrote it for his 70th birthday, which was only a few short years before he died, before that great voice was silenced forever. Heaney, as you know, was from Balahi up in County Derry. So this is a sonnet. It's that lovely, complex form. that seems to, you know, be endlessly re-inhabitable, if you like. I mean, I think of using the traditional forms that come down to us. I think of using them the way you might live in an old house, you know, and you might live in an old Georgian house or a Victorian house, or more likely a room or a flat in these old edifices. So it's like re-inhabiting those old spaces to actually, in the 21st century, to write a sonnet. I think with all those high literary forms that we receive as patterns, that if you trace them back to their roots, they nearly all go back into the folk tradition, to songs of work and struggle. So I suppose for me to reconnect to those ancient sources interests me. So this is, as I said, a sonnet, and I really made it as a kind of a toy for Seamus for his birthday, for his 70th birthday. And you know, Derry remembers in its name, it's the place of the oaks. At the root of it is Dura, the place of the oaks. And it gives us our word as well, druid, those who gather in the oaks for their mysteries. So there's a bit of play in the poem about that. In the old language, in the Irish language, every single letter has a symbiotic relationship with a tree. So it's not that the letter D, Dur, stands for an oak, or the oak stands for the letter. It may go back to when we were forest-dwelling creatures here on the island. But I love that. I love that sense of the treeness of the Irish alphabet. So it plays with that too. And it remembers crossing Merrion Square at the heart of the city. You know, that's beautiful Georgian square, where there are all these powerful institutions, right? There's the Dáil, the back gates to the Dáil. There's the National Gallery, there's the Natural History Museum, there's the, there's the IFA, isn't there? There's the Arts Council, there's the Goethe Institute. So there's a lot of these powerful institutionalized places there. But there's also the beautiful square. So this is for Seamus Heaney on his 70th birthday. Heading towards the Natural History Museum across the snowy paths of Merrion Square, the city hushed, the park deserted. In a daydream, I look up, a heaving net of branches leaf bare against the pearly sky. There, like a trireme on an opalescent ocean, or some creature of the upper air come down to nest, a cargo with a forest meme, only begotten of gall of pulp, of page, of leaflight, of feather. What snagged that book in the high reaches of the oak? A child let out of school, casting heavenward the dreary yoke? An eco-installation from an artist of the avant-garde, or the book's own deep need to be with kindred? A rootling cradled again in grandfather's arms, freed of her history, her spells, her runes, her fading charms. This next poem is called From Source to Sea, and I wrote it, well, it was actually an ask. I suppose poets in a way are most fearful of commissions or of poems that are asked for by people, because you feel a huge responsibility. I suppose I associate poetry with a very free and liberated zone. One of my old teachers back in the day wrote a small book called The Enemies of Poetry. He was a classicist, W.B. Stanford. The Enemies of Poetry really advocates that poetry is a sovereign state with its own traditions. It's not history, it's not sociology, though one may gather that kind of information from poetry. But it's an ancient tradition. It predates literature. It predates the writing down of things. It goes back into the oral tradition. And it has its own ways of being, it has its own energies, and it's not easily paraphrasable. Not easily paraphrasable. I know I've been persecuted all my life by the fetish of meaning, like what does the poem mean? I even got a letter once from someone who asked me to tell them in my own words what the poems mean. I had to reply gently and politely that the poems are my own words. But there is a fetish to paraphrase the poem, as if the poets were trying to pull some kind of coded, enigmatic number on your heads. So really, I think poetry is an experience. So this is From Source to Sea, and it was, as I say, it was asked for, so I felt a huge responsibility. And it was asked for by an organisation that I have enormous respect for, and they protect the rights to free speech and the rights of writers all over the world and other activists, and that's Amnesty International. So it was a poem written for their year of action against torture, and I was persecuted by it. You know, how do I live up to this? How do I take that responsibility and make something for them? An organisation I respect so much. So I had a memory of being in London as a young woman working there, and I met a young man who had escaped from South Africa during the era of apartheid. This would be back in the 70s, and he was in exile in London, and this is the poem. He showed me his scars. From source to sea. The light makes a river of the scars on your back. I trace it from source to sea. It spills off my page into silence, from the mouth into salt bitterness of tears, beyond comfort of song or poem. The light makes a river of the scars on your back. I trace its course from neck to hip, its silken touch, its pearly loveliness, its dream of shallows, its song of pools, its memory of curlew and nightingale, of heron and grebe. The light makes a river of the scars on your back. I walk the banks and pick for your pleasure a posy of wildflowers, the smell of their names, angelica, chamomile, calendula, dear vulneraries with their balms and their powers, their beautiful petals to soothe and to rescue, to help with the pain. I trace the river the length of your back to its source, a room, a house, a street not unlike this one. A man is closing the shutters on the light of morning, the same light everywhere we rise to and greet. He unbuttons his cuffs and rolls up his sleeves. He is ready for work. So much to be done. So, let me see. I'll just finish the reading part. Have I time to read one more poem, Lucia? Yeah. Just finish the reading part with this poem. It's another sonnet, and it's I suppose because we've been living through the commemorative years, you know, where we examine the radical beginnings of the Republic, right from 1913 and the labour activism, and especially the activism of women. I mean, it's been a great time to retrieve the stories and the complex narratives around women's part in the revolution. Because with the rise of the triumphalist, conservative Catholic state, a lot of those stories were just hidden in the archives and vanished out of telling. So it's been a great time for the complications of that time and the retrieval of stories. So this is, I came across a note in the archives. This was written before the commemorative era, obviously, but it feeds into it in some way. And I found this note in the archive, And it was written by the park superintendent in his report on the damage to St. Stephen's Green during the rising. And you know, St. Stephen's Green became a field hospital for the wounded and the injured. So there were nurses there, and of course the garrison, the College of Surgeons garrison was commanded by the Countess Markievicz. So this is his note in the archive said, 6 of our waterfowl were killed or shot, 7 of the garden seats broken, and about 300 shrubs destroyed. So this is his note on the damage, the park superintendent. And it's called Them Ducks Died for Ireland. Time slides slowly down the sash window, puddling on light on oaken boards. The green is a great lung, exhaling like breath on the pane. The seasons turn, sunset and moonset, the ebb and flow of stars. And once made mirror to smoke and fire, a republic's destiny in a countess's stride. The blood price both summons and antidote to pride. When we've licked the wounds of history, wounds of war, we'll salute the stretcher bearer, the nurse in white, the ones who pick up the pieces, who endure, who live at the edge and die there and are known by this archival footnote, read by fading light, fragile as a breath mark on the window pane or the gesture of commemorating heroes in bronze and stone. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Just push up to the microphone. And thanks so much, Paula. I'd like to begin maybe by getting you to talk a little bit about your influences. You mentioned obviously one of those poems was dedicated to Seamus Heaney. The book as a whole is dedicated to Van Boland. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about particularly those two poets and their influence on your work.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the context in which I think you always have to bear in mind when you're talking about Irish literature is that it's an island, you know, and it's quite a small, intense community, the community of poets. So you do get the chance to, I suppose, to connect up close with the living tradition, with the poets who've gone before you. And of course, Ivan is still writing and publishing, and Seamus has, as you'll be aware, has been a huge loss, not just to the Irish community, but to the international poetry community too. So I suppose I would have grown up reading their books and going to hear them reading in Dublin and in other places. So they're very much very approachable people, and a huge influence, I think, not necessarily the way they write or the kind of poem they write, but an influence in the sense that they're there and you see how they live their lives in the world as poets, how they connect to their communities, to their readers. And both of them have made, in their own way, they've opened out the possibility of the Irish poem. Seamus obviously come into his powers against the backdrop of the Northern Troubles, and how that problematized his poetry. You know, how his whole life in the art was against that context. And of course, Van Boland would have come into her voice, into her poetry at a time when really women's roles in any kind of arts in Ireland or in any kind of public life in Ireland, she was a real groundbreaker and made space, you know, through the thickets. She beat a path that we could actually follow, you know. She was a fantastically, she was a great advocate for younger women coming after her. So they had, if you like, a political dimension for those coming after them. And their integrity, their belief in poetry, the fact that they put their whole lives on the line for it. That's inspiring, and it's great to live in a community of poets where there are such inspiring figures.
Thanks. You talked a bit about the sonnet there when you were introducing those poems, and particularly this image of the sonnet as this space that you can inhabit and work with. So I was wondering if you could talk maybe a bit more about poetic forms generally and your use of them. I know that a couple of students who sent in questions were particularly interested in this, your use of specific forms, and especially maybe what point in your creative process does the poem sort of coalesce into a particular form?
Thanks. I have to say the questions I got were absolutely brilliant. You know, the questions, the list of questions and the range of interests. The relationship with form, with received form, because everything, all energy needs form to be apprehended by the other. So even if you're working in, which I do as well, in organic forms, that is, forms that, you know, develop as you write, that are not, you know, using a received pattern, you still, you know, it's still a formal engagement. And it's, if you think of language as the stuff we work with, then the part of the magic of the work is to feel the physicality of language. Pasternak, the great Russian poet, says that every single word comes with its ghost. And I write in English. It's not my mother tongue, it's more my stepmother tongue, if you like, as a colonized being, even a post-colonized being. So to work in a great imperial language, and which doesn't mean I'm working in a great empire, but I'm working with that huge language, which everywhere it's gone, it's sucked up, it's absorbed other cultural ideas in the words themselves. So it's fantastic, that sense of engagement with that tradition. And of course it's very complex for an Irish woman writing a sonnet, because the sonnet was brought, if you like, into English by the soldier poets of the Elizabethan court. And of course, you know their role here, especially in the Elizabethan plantation, where you had the soldier poets Raleigh, Walter Raleigh, and Edmund Spenser, rampaging through Munster in a process of what you can only call ethnic cleansing. And I just have this image of them with their brandishing their swords and running through the last of the Gaelic poets down there in Munster, and going back to their tents at night and cleaning the blood off their swords, picking up their quills and penning these sonnets to their beloveds, you know. So the sonnet is, if you like, these traditional forms have historical karma. So to go into them as an Irish woman, you know, I've so much scope to play with. So there's a fantastic ludic possibility there. And it is like inhabiting old places, old spaces, because forms have architecture. But as I said earlier, if you trace their origins of high literary form, you go usually back to some, you know, work songs like the Villanelle, which operates on 2 lines repeated throughout. Really has an awful lot in common with, say, the blues tradition, which comes out of, you know, the slave culture of the American South. And the Villanelle comes out of the slave culture of the big Roman farms, the latifundia of the Roman Empire. So if you go back far enough with what is understood, sometimes misunderstood as high literary form, you do find the common songs of struggle of the ordinary people. And the same with the Villanelle, with the sonnet, which goes back to Sicilian folk song, agricultural songs, quite bawdy, but they're taken up by the poets. If you think of the Romantic poets who took up the ballad, the literary ballads then become something else. So some people would see that as a process of elevating from the folk to the literary. I sometimes see it as a degeneration to the literary. But because I love the song tradition. So sonnet was got its name from sonetto, little song. So I tried to find a lyric impulse in those old forms, and they serve me well. That's all really I can say about it.
I wanted to pick up on what you were saying there about Spencer and this weird sense that a poet can go from, or a man can go from killing to writing poetry. And I was interested particularly in the idea of the poem as a political act. And you have talked about that. You said, if I can find the quote, you described poetry as a political act, an act of resistance, an act of survival. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that, particularly about the idea of politics and resistance and poetry.
Yeah. I suppose it's one of its traditional, I wouldn't say function is too cold a word and role is too cold, it's difficult. But it's a zone where poetry has, because poetry is so portable. I mean, other kinds of art, if you think of visual art, you know, you have things to move about, you know, you've objects, with highly commodifiable objects too, as we know from the history of art. But poetry, I mean, you can carry a poem in your heart, you can carry a poem in your mind. You know, even in the darkest of times, poets have been able to make their work. I think of the great Russian poet, Osip Mandelstam, who was sent to the Gulag by Stalin for writing a poem which just compared his moustache to two cockroaches copulating on his lip, and that really sent Stalin over the edge. And poor old Osip Mandelstam was sent off to the Gulag in the 30s. And I mean, there's a lot, you know, with the rise now in Europe and in other places, there is a rise in fascism, you know, in its new iteration, globalized kind of fascism. So I see great parallels with the 30s. And Stalin was so, why would a big dictator like that, why would he be so enraged by a vulnerable lyric poet? You know, the 20th century, the history of 20th century poetry has often been the holding up of private memory to totalitarian or huge edifices of the state, and saying, you know, this is my private memory, I hold this up to you in opposition to what you're telling us. So there is that tradition in poetry. And as I said, poetry can be held in the mind. It doesn't even need paper. And you see a revival of that sense of the orality in the spoken word tradition, which is very, very vital here now on the island. So it's the ideal form, it's the ideal art for people who have nothing. And that's where it really often comes into its real power and strength. People who have absolutely nothing can carry a poem. So that interests me, that's always interested me, that it can be a vehicle in circumstances that are totally intolerable. I think of all, I mean, I'm very aware that as I stand here and speak to you, and I have, you know, I can say more or less what I want. That's becoming rarer and rarer. I mean, academic freedom is under threat now. And there are countries, even as I speak, there are countries where poets are in prison for what we would just consider, you know, the private lyric. It's not like they're saying, come to the barricades and pull down the state. They're giving witness to their private and intimate lives. But why does that threaten totalitarian regimes? Why does private witness threaten them? Isn't that the question that poetry puts out there? So to me, it's a very ancient and noble tradition, and is a site. I mean, it's not, the language of poetry is not the language of politics. Going back to what I said earlier about it being a sovereign state. It's not history, it's not sociology, it's not even political discourse. Its role is really to preserve the inarticulate speech of the heart, if you like, to quote Van Morrison, a great lyricist. So I think that's one of its really valuable roles, is to preserve human dignity and witness in the face of totalitarian disrespect for human values.
You mentioned memory there and the idea of the poem as an act of memory. And memory obviously is really central to Painting Rain as a volume, both in terms of particularly family memory and personal memory, but also commemoration, for example, in the last poem that you read. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of memory in the volume specifically.
Okay. Well, I suppose it goes out more into a general statement that the work of poets has always been memory. I mean, that's the work in language, to encode memory in language. What's encoded in language, the kind of memory that the poet has to encode might change. And certainly the relationship of the poet to the technology changes. If you think back to the days when the poet had to hold in mind, in memory, the necessary lore of the community, not just their creation stories and their legends, but useful information, the laws around genealogy. And you see that in the earliest books. You see in the earliest books the features and the vestigial, if you like, processes of the oral culture. If you even think of the Bible, all those genealogies, I mean, they're a sign of the kind of memory that the poet once had to hold in mind. You know, the bloodlines. And if you think of small tribes, to keep the bloodlines clear and to know who's related to who was really practical thing for the poet to do. Some cultures, they would have had to hold in mind the lore around planting, times of harvest, when to plant, and to encode that in language that other people could remember as well. So some of the things we associate with poetry, like rhyme, or the strict kind of rhythmic patterning that you see again and again in every generation, that's part of the encoding into memory. They're mnemonic devices. In contemporary poetry, you can see them reasserting themselves as the site of energy moves from the book to the machine. So we're in as big a kind of a cultural shift now with the machine memory as we once were with the shift from the oral to the book. And you remember the trouble that shift caused. I mean, we're still fighting wars over the holy books, you know, over that shift. These technological changes are long-term and they affect poetry directly. As the authority went to the book, as the laws started to be written down and the book became the authority, then people went to the book for that kind of memory. And poetry kind of, in some ways, retreated into the book in a certain way. Certainly in some cultures, retreated into the academy. And now we're on this shift where machine memory, I mean, the first 5 hits on Google are probably going to be the communal memory at the minute, you know. And all that is to be played for, and where the poet fits into the new machine world is all to be played for. I know that the younger poets I know, they often go straight onto YouTube. They bypass the book altogether. And they give a simulacrum, if you like, of the oral. It looks like a revival of the oral tradition. But you must remember that digitized sound, the actual sound waves, are not the same as what happens today, where I'm speaking directly to you and where you're hearing the poems directly with the full sound waves. Digitizing sound flattens the sound wave. So you're looking at a screen, someone's speaking poetry directly at you, but you're not getting the full resonance of the full sound. But it's close to the oral, and I mean, it's really all to be played for, and where the poet will find the memory work there is interesting. And I'm watching that space with great interest. But it's all about memory still. What we have to remember changes. As I said, in the 20th century, what we had to encode and hold up and give, if you like, out in the poetry was private memory. That may now change again. I notice there's a sense of pressure now on the poet to again speak as a communal creature, you know, to have nearly even a kind of a tribal identity with their audience.
Just to pick up on that, the first two poems you read were poems about your grandparents, and obviously that sense of lineage and family connection is a really important part of the volume. And I was wondering, obviously throughout your work, the idea of community is also very important from your earliest work. So I was wondering if you might talk a bit about that sort of intersection between family and community, in particular in these poems in Painting Rain.
I suppose, well, again, I think the relationship is never straightforward, you know, and I know that in the phases of a poet's life, usually the early phases involve some dislocation or some maybe some argument, if you like, with community, with family. And often, of course, you know, within the family, having a poet in the family can threaten a family. You know, I know all through my younger life, whenever I was at family gatherings and there was a good story being told, I can remember my father saying, "Don't be telling her that, for God's sake. That'll be in a poem, it'll be all over the place. Don't say anything to her about it." So there's a sense of, especially because I'm from a working class background, maybe of privacy, or, you know, the sense of family material being brought out into the world. So that would have always been a kind of a shadow or an issue that had to be kind of worked through. And yet you can only write the poems you're given. I mean, those of you who are writing will be realizing that, if you haven't already realized it, that in fact there's material, there's obsessive material that is always seeking a way through. Because we are, in a way, you know, instruments of we channel things. So there's obsessive material that is looking for formal expression. And I think most people, certainly my experience as a young woman when I started in becoming obsessed with poetry, was it was very expressive, you know. I wanted to express things. A lot of it was in journals or diaries, and the last thing I would have done was share it with anyone. I was a secret poet for as long as it took to protect myself. And then, you know, the journey, once you start publishing, the energies change a bit. But certainly that early phase where I had no choice. I don't know if poets have any choice in what they write about. I mean, you think you're making a conscious choice, but always there's subconscious material pushing through that is demanding expression. So my relationship around family and community has been difficult at times. But I really do want, I always have wanted to honour the community I come from, because while the North Inner City, Finglas, you know, old working class areas, and to see with my own eyes what those communities have come through and what their struggle has been continuously, you know, not just in like the bad old 50s, not just in, you know, the 70s, not just when heroin hit those communities and absolutely wrecked generations of kids who should be really the community leaders. And not just now, post-crash, when you see those communities kind of bearing the brunt. So part of always of my impulse to poetry is to honour those communities and to you know, not mind you that they might appreciate or ask to be honoured in any way, but you know, that's been part of what I've felt the need to put on the record, their lives and their struggles, and their, but also I'm very aware that's where I got language. You know, that's where I was given language by those communities. So I have a huge debt to repay.
The issue of place there, which obviously you've made central in some ways to community, is very important in your work, especially the representation of Dublin. But I was wondering, especially in Painting Rain, if we look at that first poem, Death of a Field, there's a very strong engagement with the current ecological crisis in particular. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your interest in the environment in that broader sense.
Yeah. Well, it's the beautiful earth, isn't it? I mean, this is our home planet, and we're not likely to have another planet to wreck soon. So we better just try and survive on it. I mean, it would be as simple as that. You know, Irish poets are often, you know, credited. One of the things often said is that we have great sense of place. But you know, that also involves some kind of sense in language responsibility for those places, that, you know, the lyric, the singing into being of a place is such an ancient impulse, you know, especially, you know, if you go back to cultures that have lived very lightly on the planet, often vulnerable cultures, they say that Language Death, a book by David Crystal, he, from his research, has found that a language dies every fortnight. Usually indigenous languages, often very small languages only spoken by, you know, a diminishing tribe. But that sense that as we lose language and as we lose indigenous peoples and as we wreck the places where these indigenous peoples have made lives for thousands of years, you know, I think poetry has some kind of function, again that terrible word, or role, again that terrible word, if not, I mean, I don't know that you can save anything, but you can certainly map out places that are vulnerable. And I suppose the Death of a Field, the first poem in the book, it does come from that time where we witnessed here the kind of turbo development of the last boom. And I know things are picking up again. You start to see the cranes erect over the city. And of course, do you learn anything? Have we learned anything from the last cycle of turbo development, where you saw very vulnerable landscapes totally wrecked, you know? And well, the thing that really occupies me to the point of anxiety, because there's one thing, you know, being cold and clinical about the wrecking of your small island home, but something that really causes me anxiety is the notion that we would frack our beautiful lake district, you know, Leitrim and Fermanagh, which is a complex situation because of the dual jurisdiction up there around the border. That beautiful lakeland, which will be the aquifers for future generations. It's where we will get our water supply for your great, 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 great grandchildren. You know, the idea that we would poison those wells, those sources, I find that abhorrent and certainly worth mentioning, if not actively fighting for. So those things worry me. In the city, I have seen displacement of community because of the value of land and the value of property. And so I mean, we're coming into another cycle of development. You can just see it, you can feel it. And whether we learned any lessons from the last one is to be seen.
Okay, speaking of the future, I suppose makes us think about the poetry that's still going on. And obviously we've been reading Painting Rain specifically, but Paula has a new book out called Geomantic, which was just launched last week. So I'd just like to conclude by inviting her to read a couple of poems from that.
Yeah.
Is that okay? And to thank her very much for today.
Yeah. Thanks. So I'll read two short poems from this new book, which I perceived as it's inspired by the memorial quilts that the communities made for their young dead. And I'll read just a couple of poems from that. The Old Neighbourhood. I was dreaming of Gardner Street again, Georgian inner cityscape, how they named it when they laid it out somewhat like a natal horoscope, squares that trine and sextile country seats. As if summoned on some psychic Skype, the ghosts of my childhood manifest, my feral girls, my angels, who skipped summer into being with each beat. And I'll finish with this poem, which is called The Last Thing. All these poems are short. They're all 9 lines long. There's 81 of them. They're all 9 syllables each line. So it's a very kind of obsessive work. I see it as a kind of patchwork quilt, and you can read it in any direction you like, backwards or forwards. So The Last Thing, and it seems like a fitting poem to end the session with. And thank you very much for your attention today. And thank you very much for your attention in reading the book as part of your studies. Okay, the last thing my ebbing father said to me was not the wind before he slipped below the horizon of his morphine dream. So was it the moon in the hospice rigging, or the cloud's buoyant shadow, or my mother's voice helming him home? No, I think it was some ferocious winged creature at the ward's window, breast feathers flecked with salt-laced foam. So thank you for your attention this morning. Massive, really.